Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Essential, The Dealer's Diva reaches a turning point in her life with this powerful E-Steam series story. Get E-Steam Essential at online booksellers today. Big box retailer Toys R Us has announced it's going to close all 800 of its stores and liquidate all of its inventory. And the announcement that Toys R Us is going out of business has a major ripple effect throughout the entire toy industry, which has been in a state of decline over the last few years. Manufacturers like Hasbro and Mattel and Jakks Pacific all saw their stock prices decline, and many smaller toy companies are now wondering where are they going to stock their toys now that the only options they have are Target and Walmart, places where the toy sections are far smaller than the big box retailer Toys R Us. Now, Toys R Us's decline is something that has been going on for the last decade. And the reason why Toys R Us has been in decline is because after a leveraged buyout by FAO Schwarz almost 10 years ago, the company was just keeping its head above water. Because with this leveraged buyout by FAO Schwarz, what happened was the company was absorbed a lot of debt. And it was looking for ways to pay that debt off. Unfortunately, it was what happened with Toys R Us is they installed the FAO Schwarz CEO as the CEO of Toys R Us. And when the FAO Schwarz CEO was placed as the CEO of Toys R Us, what happened was Toys R Us changed from a big box retailer who was focused primarily on low prices and moving large amounts of inventory to a kind of mid-level retailer with higher prices, because once the FAO Schwarz CEO became the CEO of Toys R Us, instead of toys like action figures and collectibles being priced at a level lower than places like Walmart and Target and many other retailers like Sears at the time and Kmart, toy prices actually went up at Toys R Us, and they were priced higher, and that led to people having less incentive to go shop at Toys R Us first. Instead, they decided to start picking up their toys at Walmart, Target, and other big box retailers, which allowed you to purchase toys at a lower price. And once Amazon got into the toy business more seriously, because Amazon had always been in the toy business and at one time was affiliated with Toys R Us towards producing toys at lower prices, what happened was Amazon started to dominate the toy retail market along with Walmart and Target, and Toys R Us was no longer as competitive as it was because this FAO Schwarz CEO decided he wanted to keep prices on the higher end. And because he kept prices on the higher end in the same way he did at FAO Schwarz, Toys R Us began to go into decline on the consumer side. Meanwhile, they were trying to deal with this debt issue from that leverage buyout. And because they were trying to deal with this large amount of debt they had from the leverage buyout, what happened was the Toys R Us brand became where it became insolvent. And because it became insolvent due to these debts, they tried to reemerge out of bankruptcy last last year. They tried to declare bankruptcy to reemerge out of it. Unfortunately, they just could not find a buyer. And the reason why Toys R Us just couldn't find a buyer was because no smart individual is going to buy a corporation that has a whole bunch of debt from a leveraged buyout. Because when you buy this company, you are also buying all of their debt. This is no different than what I saw once A&P decided it wanted to buy Pathmark here in New York. A&P, the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, decided it wanted to buy Pathmark in 2000 and 2001, and after that, the entire A&P brand went into complete decline because they had no way to pay off all of those debts that they had. Because once you buy a company and you buy all of their debts, what happens is you have to pay all those debts, and eventually you wind up with the company going completely underwater. Now, a smart person in this situation, they would have waited for the company to go bankrupt and then buy the brand and the assets and the property in bankruptcy court, similar to what McKee Foods did with Hostess and Drake's. When Hostess's union had that strike and then Hostess went out of business, what happened was the people with Hostess, McKee Foods, waited until they went into bankruptcy court and they bought the assets of Hostess Foods for pennies on the dollar. Unfortunately, FAO Schwarz went with this leveraged buyout, and now there's a major gaping hole in the toy industry as related to retail and distribution, because Toys R Us was the place where many people primarily were looking to find their toys first before they went to Amazon.com or they went to Walmart and Target. And it was also an incubator where many smaller toy companies like Toy Biz back in the day were able to establish themselves as a serious brand. Toys R Us back in the day was the place where many toy companies were like Jakks Pacific, like Toy Biz, like Thinkway, and many smaller toy companies like Just Toys were able to start to get some footing and able to start building their brand. And this is something that will have a major impact on the toy industry, an industry that has been in decline over the last few years as children have changed the way they play, because instead of playing with physical toys in most cases these days, many children are playing more video games or they're working with more apps on things like tablets and smartphones. And when I take a real serious critical look at Toys R Us, they made some serious blunders over the last couple of years as related to products they have stocked on their shelves, and many toy companies made mistakes that led to the decline of Toys R Us overall. And when I take a look at what Toys R Us stocked in some cases, they went with an overinvestment in the Star Wars brand, and that was primarily part of Hasbro's fault, because Hasbro, seeing that Star Wars was somewhat popular over the last 15, 20 years with the original trilogy, they anticipated big profits as related to the new trilogy. Unfortunately, when it comes down to the new trilogy, many toy collectors just don't like many of the characters like Finn, Rey, or that I can't remember his name, but that guy in black. They don't like those characters, and they have no incentive to go out and buy those characters. Unfortunately, Hasbro continued to pump out figures and vehicles in mass for Star Wars, and while figures for Last Jedi, The Force Awakens, and Rogue One have rotted on toy shelves, Toys R Us was stuck with inventory, and because they continued to follow the FAO Schwarz model for business, they did not make efforts to clearance this inventory at a rapid pace. Instead, what they did was hold on to this inventory. Meanwhile, places like Walmart and Target were having clearance sales to get rid of this stuff. Toys R Us, like FAO Schwarz back in the day, continued to hold on to it. And that's one of the things that led to them having some of the trouble that they had. But one of the big reasons they had that trouble was because Hasbro overinvested in Star Wars and believed it was going to be this big property. But Star Wars has fizzled out at retail after almost 20 years of being a very viable brand after its revival back in the late 1990s. Now, the other thing related to the decline of Toys R Us was the mismanagement of the Mattel brand. Now, Mattel's brand was one of those that was very strong, and they had several licensed properties like DC Universe Classics back in the day that used to get many toy collectors into toy stores. Unfortunately, after the New 52 reboot of the DC Universe, many DC collectors had no incentive to come in, but Mattel was still getting money from the WWE license it bought after Jakks Pacific lost a license, and that was still bringing people in. However, they had another brand that was doing very strongly, which was Monster High. And with the Monster High reboot, what happened was many people, like goths and many other people who used to buy Monster High, had no incentive to buy Monster High because the story that they enjoyed with Monster High was changed to a dumbed down, almost Sesame Street level type story. And that's what led to many Monster High dolls languishing on the shelves and the Monster High brand going into complete decline. Another thing that happened to lead to Mattel making some bad decisions was what they did with these kind of trying to change gender roles with toys. Now, with two of their lines, DC Superhero Girls and the WWE Superstars, they wanted to make girl characters and put them in boys' toy aisles. Unfortunately, what happened was most people wound up rejecting this concept. I see with the WWE Superstars line, which just features these WWE divas, which are placed right next to the male wrestlers. These characters are shelf warming, just like the DC Superhero Girls action figures shelf warm in the girls section of most toy aisles and Toys R Us, because when it comes down to people, they have clear gender roles where they want to play there with their toys, and many collectors buy certain characters from certain lines. And Toys R Us has had a compound problems as related to what led to their decline, and their decline again started with that leverage buyout from FAO Schwarz, and the FAO Schwarz CEO being installed as the CEO of Toys R Us, him changing the Toys R Us brand from a discount retailer where people got the lowest prices on toys to sort of a mid-end, high-end retailer people went to, and that led to the raising of prices at Toys R Us when people buying figures like Marvel Legends back in the day for $8.99 to the price going up to almost $15 to now $20 now. And that's what led to a lot of people not going to Toys R Us first and instead choosing to go to places like Amazon and Walmart for lower prices, or the collectors who wanted to make sure they got mint in box packaging, they went to a place like BigBad.ToyStore.com where they could get mint in box packaging, and they had options like Pile of Loot where they could literally get an entire group of toys shipped to them for a low price. So competitors wound up beating Toys R Us at its own game. And what also caused Toys R Us to go into decline, in addition to the leverage buyout and the competitors, was the fact that many toy companies were releasing toys that wound up not being appealing to children. This was one of the big issues with many of these manufacturers that I've heard from many collectors, is that the toy companies like Hasbro, like Mattel, like Jakks Pacific are not really making toys that appeal to children. And I can see that on the toy store shelves when I see things like all of those Star Wars toys that literally take up almost an entire aisle, but just are sitting like all their shelf warming. And I see toy lines like WWE Superstars, which feature the divas as dolls and is placed right next to the wrestlers, and and the boys are just ignoring it, and the girls are just ignoring it. Or your DC Superhero Girls, where they go out here and they present you these girl action figures, and they're in the girl aisle, and girls just don't want to be interested in them. Or things like what Mattel did with Monster High, where you take a popular brand which could have gone at least another 10, 15 years just on reissues of dolls alone, and then go out, reboot that brand, dumb it down, and now the dolls have no audience. I see a lot of mistakes that many of these toy companies made regarding their toys and their toy lines, and those were some of the things that helped torpedo Toys R Us and keep and put it in the history books as one of the dead retailers out here. I believe that if Toys R Us had somebody there as a CEO who were able to manage it properly, they might have been able to emerge out of bankruptcy. But when I take a look at the big picture of it, all the seeds were laid in place for the end of Toys R Us back in the mid 2000s before the recession. And what we're seeing right now with the closing of Toys R Us is an inevitability that was just going to happen. And those owners were just were trying to buy time with the bankruptcy, and they were gambling that someone would go out here and be the new owner of Toys R Us. But no smart businessman was going to go and buy Toys R Us, a company that was bogged down in debt, had a business model that was not competitive, and many toy companies producing products designed to appeal to no one. Everything was laid out for the end of Toys R Us, and now many in the toy industry are wondering where they're going to go to sell their toys, and many people who bought toys are wondering where they're going to buy their toys. And I have to wonder, Will Walmart or Target pick up the slack in the toy aisle by expanding their toy aisles, or will a new retailer emerge to enter the very volatile toy retail business, a business with a razor thin profit margin, and one that shows me that you really need to know what you're doing in the toy business in order to keep that business going. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.